They called her a liability. Not in those exact words. Men like Vincent Caruso never said what they meant directly. They said it in the way they looked past her at board meetings, in the way they laughed a little too long at the wrong moments, in the way his mother held her champagne glass just slightly tighter when Nora Beckett walked into the room. She was 28 years old, a size 18, and about to become the wife of the most dangerous man in New Orleans. The announcement had come the way most things came in the Caruso world, without her consent, and with a great deal of fanfare. Vincent Caruso, undisputed head of the Gulf Coast Syndicate, had chosen her. Not because she was beautiful by the standards his world preferred. Not because her family had money or power or connections worth trading. He had chosen Nora Beckett because 3 months earlier, she had sat across from him in a federal mediation hearing, representing the interests of a shipping company he was quietly trying to acquire, and she had dismantled his legal team so thoroughly and so quietly that he'd had to excuse himself to make a phone call. He'd called his consigliere, Enzo, and said 4 words. "Find out who she is." Nora didn't know any of that on the morning of the wedding. She knew only that Vincent Caruso had made her an offer that her father, a good man with a gambling debt the size of a small country, could not afford to refuse. She had agreed to 2 years, a contract marriage, discretion on both sides, separate bedrooms. She had packed 3 boxes of books, her grandmother's cast-iron skillet, and a handgun she'd been licensed to carry since she was 22, courtesy of a father who'd loved her enough to teach her to protect herself, even when he couldn't protect much else. The wedding was held at the Caruso estate on the edge of the Garden District. A white columned house so large it had its own name, Bellemont, stitched into the iron gate in letters that had not rusted in 40 years. There were 300 guests. Nora knew none of them. She wore a dress that had been chosen for her, ivory silk that cost more than her rent, and she walked down an aisle lined with white gardenias, while people she'd never met assessed her the way they might assess a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the rest of the room. She heard the first one when she passed the 3rd row. He could have had anyone. She didn't turn her head. She had learned a long time ago that turning your head was how they knew they'd gotten to you. Vincent was waiting at the altar in a charcoal suit, dark-eyed and unreadable, and when she reached him, he looked at her for a long moment, not the way men looked at her when they wanted her to feel small, but the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand. He said very quietly, "You look like you're walking into a deposition." "I'm always prepared for things to go sideways," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. They were married by a priest who owed Vincent Caruso a favor, which Nora suspected was true of most people in the room. The first month at Bellemont was an education in being invisible. Not the way she had been invisible at the wedding. That had been too loud, too observed, the particular cruelty of being looked at while being dismissed. This was something different. At Bellemont, she simply wasn't factored in. Meetings happened around her. Decisions were made in rooms she wasn't invited to enter. Vincent's lieutenants, a rotating cast of expensive suits with careful eyes, treated her with the precise degree of courtesy that signaled they had been instructed to treat her with courtesy and nothing more. His mother, Constance Caruso, called her the girl for the first 3 weeks. Not maliciously, exactly, more the way you might call a stray cat the cat, acknowledging its presence without committing to its permanence. Nora responded by learning everything she could. She was, at her core, a researcher. It was what had made her exceptional at her job, before her job had become living inside the most heavily guarded home in Louisiana. She catalogued names. She memorized faces. She paid attention to the way certain conversations stopped when she entered rooms, and she made notes. Not on paper, never on paper in a house like this, but in the reliable architecture of her own memory, which had been her most dangerous asset since she was 11 years old and could recite entire case transcripts from a single read. Vincent noticed. She wasn't sure when, exactly, but somewhere in the 2nd month the way he spoke to her shifted. Not warmer, precisely, more direct. He stopped the performance of polite disregard and started talking to her the way he talked to Enzo, like someone whose opinion might be worth the air it took to answer. "You've been watching Ghana," he said one evening, setting his glass down on the kitchen counter where she was reading. "Not a question. He flinches every time Enzo mentions the Landry accounts," she said, without looking up from her book. "Either he skimmed something and is hoping no one noticed, or someone has leverage on him and he's hoping no one notices that either." Silence. Then, "Which do you think it is?" She looked up then. "The second one. Men who steal get defensive. Men who are owned get quiet." Vincent looked at her for a long moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat. Down they talked until 2 a.m. It happened again the next night, and the night after that. She didn't let herself think about what it meant. She was a contract, not a wife, and the contract had an expiration date, and she was very good at keeping track of terms. The Caruso name carried weight, and weight, in this world, attracted people who wanted a piece of it. What Vincent's rivals saw was a don who had gone soft, a man who had walked into a courthouse and walked out with a civilian, of all things. A lawyer, no less, and not even a beautiful one, not by their measure. They saw Nora Beckett and they saw weakness, they saw an opening. The murmurs started in March. By April, they had condensed into something more deliberate. 3 families who had kept their distance from the Carusos for a decade began meeting in places they thought were private. There were calls intercepted. There were names spoken in the wrong company. Vincent knew. He always knew. But knowing and being able to act are different things, and the situation required patience, and patience required keeping certain cards very close to the chest, including, for the moment, his wife. Nora was not told about the threat. This was, as it turned out, a significant miscalculation. April became May, and May brought with it the kind of heavy, breathing heat that New Orleans wore like a second skin. The city bloomed into something almost violent, all jasmine and magnolia and the low, persistent smell of the river, and Bellemont's gardens went lush and overripe the way they did every year, bees drunk on the wisteria that climbed the south wall. Nora had found a routine. Mornings, she ran case law for a small firm that had agreed to let her work remotely. Vincent had not asked her to stop working, which had surprised her. Afternoons, she read. She had commandeered a window seat in the library that looked out over the back lawn, and she had positioned herself there so thoroughly that the household staff had begun leaving a fresh carafe of coffee on the table beside it without being asked. She was there on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of May when she heard the first sound that didn't belong. It was small, a soft displacement of air on the ground floor below the library. The old house breathed and settled constantly, all that wood and plaster contracting in the heat, and most people wouldn't have noticed. Nora noticed because she had spent 2 months memorizing the way Bellemont breathed, and this was different. She set down her book. The house was quiet in the way that only happened when the usual layer of background noise had been removed. No footsteps from the kitchen, where Hector usually worked this time of day. No low murmur of the security radio from the front hall. Hector was always in the kitchen on Tuesday afternoons. She was already moving. The gun was in her bedroom, and she went for it the way she had been trained. No running, no unnecessary sound, every step placed with deliberate care on the floorboards she knew didn't creak. She retrieved it from the lockbox inside her nightstand, checked the chamber from memory, and was back in the hallway in 45 seconds. From the top of the stairs, she could see the front foyer. 2 men she didn't recognize were standing just inside the front door, which meant the door had been opened from the inside, which meant someone on the security detail had either been bought or been dealt with. One of the men had a radio in his hand. The other was watching the staircase with the practiced stillness of someone who had done this before and expected it to be simple. Nora did not panic. She had always found in high-pressure situations that her mind simply got quieter, not calmer exactly, but more focused, the way a lens tightens when you turn it towards something specific she assessed, too visible, Unknown number unaccounted for. They hadn't seen her. The foyer's ceiling height put her at a significant elevation advantage from the top of the stairs. The chandelier's reflection in the entry mirror gave her partial sight lines into the dining room to the left. A third man was moving through the dining room toward the kitchen. She processed this. 3, minimum, possibly more covering the exterior. Vincent was at a meeting downtown. He wouldn't be back for another 2 hours. The security team had been compromised at the entry point, which meant she could not assume anyone downstairs was friendly. She thought with a clarity that surprised even her. They interrupted my afternoon. Then she got to work. The thing that people who had never been trained for violence consistently misunderstood was that it was not in the moment dramatic. It was engineering. You identified the variables. You removed them in the correct order. You did not deviate from the sequence once you had committed to it. Nora had learned to shoot from her father in the flat fields of central Louisiana, where they drove every summer to visit her grandmother, and where he had set up cans on fence posts and taught her that a gun was only as useful as the steadiness of the person holding it. She had practiced through her 20s out of habit and a low-grade conviction that the world was not always as safe as it looked, and she had become, without ever intending to be anything in particular, a very good shot. She used that now. The man watching the staircase went down before he could call out. The one with the radio raised it to his mouth, and she crossed the distance faster than he'd anticipated. She was light on her feet in a way that consistently surprised people who saw her body before they understood it. And he did not complete the call. The third man came out of the kitchen at the sound of the commotion and found a woman he had never been briefed on standing in the middle of the foyer, holding a cig, sour with the level certainty of someone who had already decided how this would end. He made a choice that demonstrated poor judgment. She made a choice that demonstrated considerably better judgment. The whole thing took less than 4 minutes. She was sitting at the bottom of the stairs, her breathing even, her hands still. When Vincent walked through the front door 14 minutes later, his meeting had been cut short. The call had come through from Enzo, and he had driven back through the garden district doing things that were inadvisable even in a car with his specifications. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the foyer. He looked at Nora. She looked back at him and said, "There were 3. There may be more on the perimeter. You should call Enzo." Vincent Caruso, who had walked through worse than this and kept his composure, stood in his own front door and did not say anything for a full 4 seconds. Then he said, "Are you hurt?" "No." Another pause. "The kitchen. I know about the kitchen," she said. "Hector is all right. He's in the pantry. I put him there." Vincent crossed the foyer in 5 strides and crouched down in front of her, and she realized, with the particular delayed awareness that came after adrenaline began to recede, that he was looking at her the way a person looks at something they are only beginning to understand the dimensions of. "Nora," he said. "I know," she said. "We need to talk about your vetting process for the security team." He laughed. It was not a smooth sound. It was surprised and unguarded, and she had never heard it before, and it did something to the inside of her chest that she filed away to examine later, when there wasn't blood on her marble floor. The weeks that followed reshaped the landscape of Bellemont entirely. Enzo, who had treated her for 4 months with the careful neutrality of a man maintaining a professional fiction, came to her directly the morning after and said, without preamble, "I owe you an apology." He was a compact, silver-haired man of 62 who did not make apologies easily. She appreciated the economy of it. "You didn't know what I was," she said. "Neither did they. We should have tried harder to find out." She considered that. "Yes," she said, "you should have." Constance Caruso came to her room on a Thursday, which was unusual enough that Nora simply waited, patient, while the older woman arranged herself in the chair by the window and appeared to formulate what she wanted to say. "My son has made exactly one decision in 20 years of running this family that I thought was a mistake," Constance said finally. "I know," Nora said. "You thought he'd chosen poorly." Constance looked at her with the sharpest eyes Nora had encountered outside of a courtroom. I thought he'd chosen poorly, she confirmed. I was wrong. You didn't have enough information. The older woman's mouth softened just slightly. We are not, as a family, accustomed to underestimating people. No, Nora agreed. You just didn't look closely enough. Constance studied her for a long moment. Then she said, My son looks at you differently now. He looks at me like he's running an assessment. My son has run assessments on people his entire adult life, Constance said. He doesn't look at them the way he looks at you. Nora didn't answer that. She looked out the window at the garden, the wisteria going brown now at the edges, the heat taking its toll. What did you do? Constance asked. Before he found you. I was a contract attorney. Before that. Nora was quiet for a moment. My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. I spent 2 summers in my 20s doing volunteer security work in places where it was needed. I was very good at it. I stopped because I decided I wanted a quieter life. And now? She turned from the window. Now I think I was wrong about what I wanted. The full picture of the conspiracy came out over the following 3 weeks, as Enzo and Vincent worked through the threads. 3 families. A coordinated play. The man who had brokered the agreement was a figure called Bernard Lacoste, a money man who operated in the comfortable shadow between legitimate finance and less legitimate interests, and who had wagered, incorrectly, that the Caruso organization's new weak point was its leadership's lapse in judgment. The lapse in judgment, as it turned out, had been the other party's own. Nora was in the room when Enzo laid out the last of the evidence, not because she had asked to be, because Vincent had come to find her and said simply, Come, I want you there. She sat at the long mahogany table in the war room, a room she had never been invited into before, and she listened, and when Enzo finished she said, Lacoste's leverage on the other families is financial. If the Landry accounts surface, 2 of the 3 have more to lose from each other than from you. They'll fracture on their own. The room was quiet. Vincent looked at her. You knew about the Landry accounts. I knew something was wrong with them. I didn't know the specifics. She paused. Garner told me the specifics last week. He came to me, not Enzo. I think he was embarrassed. Enzo said slowly, Garner told you. He was owned, like I said. Once the owner is identified, the ownership stops being useful. She folded her hands on the table. He just needed someone to tell him there was a way out. Another silence. Longer this time. We could use that, one of the lieutenants said. Yes, Vincent said, not looking at the lieutenant, still looking at Nora. We could. The Lacoste situation was resolved with a specificity and quietness that became a kind of legend in the months that followed. Not because of the outcome, which had been inevitable from the moment the Carusos identified the full shape of the conspiracy, but because of the method which bore none of the blunt force signatures of the previous administration. It was precise. It was surgical. It left each of the 3 families nursing a wound that turned their attention inward rather than outward. Nora was not in the room for any of that. She had provided what she knew. What was done with it was not her department, or so she had thought. 3 months into their arrangement, she had a conversation with Vincent that began at 11 o'clock at night in the kitchen. She had been making tea. He had come down for reasons he didn't explain, and ended at 3 in the morning, which was becoming a pattern she was finding difficult to attribute entirely to insomnia. He said, The contract, she said, I know. The contract had 11 months remaining. This was a fact she had been aware of with the same low-grade precision with which she tracked most things. She had thought about it more in the last few weeks than she had in the 4 months before that. What do you want to do about it? He asked. The way he asked was careful, more careful than most things he said, and he was, she had learned, a careful man. She looked at her tea. I want to know why you chose me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, The deposition. I know about the deposition. I mean, why me specifically? You could have hired me. You could have found a dozen attorneys who would have been glad for your business. I didn't want an attorney I could hire, he said. I wanted to know if you were someone who could stand in a room that was hostile to you and not change the way you held yourself." She looked up at him. "And you didn't change at all." He said it like it was the rarest thing he'd ever observed. "You were the only person in that room who didn't change for the room." She thought about that. "I never learned how," she said. "I tried for a long time. I used to think that was a flaw." "It's not." "No," she said slowly. "I know that now." The kitchen clock moved. Somewhere in the house, a shutter knocked softly against the siding in the evening wind off the river. "The contract," he said again. "I'd like to renegotiate it," she said. "The terms, not the parties." He looked at her for a long moment, and for once the careful assessment had something else underneath it, something unguarded, more open than she had seen from him, the kind of expression she suspected he showed to very few people. "The parties," he said, "are non-negotiable." "Good," she said. "I was hoping you'd say that." The Caruso family held a dinner in June, an annual event that drew everyone who mattered within 400 miles of New Orleans, and for the first time in the 4 years since Vincent had taken over the organization, the woman at the head of the table beside him was someone who did not flinch when the room fell quiet, or shift when the scrutiny became specific. Nora Beckett, or Nora Caruso, as she had quietly, without announcement, begun to sign certain documents, sat at that table and received the assessments of the men and women around her, with the same composure she had brought to every room that had ever decided she was beneath its notice. A man named Theodore Barrow, who ran interests in Memphis and had cultivated a reputation for directness that he apparently considered a personality, said to her over the fish course, "I'll be honest. When I heard about the arrangement, I thought Vincent had lost his mind." Nora picked up her wine glass. "And now I'm revising my opinion. Of the arrangement? Of a lot of things," Barrow said, with the particular humility of a man who didn't practice it often. Later, after the dinner had ended, and the last guests had made their way out through the great front door, Vincent came to find her on the back terrace, where she had retreated with a final glass of wine and the river smell of the evening, which she had grown genuinely fond of, without quite realizing it. He stood beside her and didn't say anything for a while. That was something she had come to appreciate about him, that he understood silence as something other than a void to fill. "Barrow offered you a compliment," he said finally. "He offered me a revised assessment. It's not quite the same thing." "No," he said. "It's better." She considered the dark garden. The wisteria was coming back, she noticed, new growth climbing along the south wall, pale green in the nightlight. Things that got cut back had a way of returning stronger. "You should have told me about the threat," she said. "Yes, you won't make that mistake again." "No," he said, "I won't." She turned to look at him, and he was looking back at her, and there was nothing in his expression now that was assessment or strategy or careful management of information. He looked, she thought, simply like a man who had found something he hadn't been looking for and was still adjusting to the dimensions of it. "We're not going to be a quiet household," she said. "I know, there will be more of this. I should be told things." "You'll be told everything," he said. "From now on." She nodded once. Then she looked back at the garden, at the wisteria moving slowly in the river-warm air. "I liked the quiet life I thought I wanted," she said. "I really believed I wanted it. And now?" She was quiet for a moment. The city breathed around them, that old exhale of heat and music and water, the smell of something alive and ungovernable just beyond the walls. "Now," Nora said, "I think I was made for exactly this." The man who had underestimated her once, who had built a world around the calculation that she was a quiet woman with useful skills and a limited appetite for disruption, had learned something in the months since she had walked into his house with 3 boxes of books and her grandmother's cast-iron skillet and a gun she'd hoped never to use. He had learned that the most dangerous people were not the ones who announced themselves. They were the ones who sat in window seats and read, and waited, and paid very close attention. And when the room required it, when it interrupted her afternoon, when it came through the front door with the wrong intentions, and the mistaken belief that it had accounted for every variable. She was exactly as ready as she had always been. She just hadn't told anyone.